So what are we going to look at today? Um, today I've really squished together what I consider to be the three main areas of climate psychology. So it's kind of like three different talks in one. Um, I expect that each of you will be interested in a slightly different part. So, take what you need and leave the rest. But in a sense, it's all connected and it's all relevant. First, we're going to be looking at the psychology of stuckness and denial, if you will, but I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Next, we're going to be looking at the psychology of healthy climate action and engagement. So once you've moved through the sort of resistance that a lot of us feel, or if you're in the business of trying to engage others, how can you do that in such a way that feels good for everybody and therefore is sustainable? And then finally, we're going to look at some suggestions really for how anybody can be handling all of the difficult feelings that arise when we really face up to the reality of the climate and ecological crisis. Um, a lot of this is relevant for when we're supporting other people, but really the work does start with us. So as I go through everything today, um, even if you work in sustainability, which I know that many of you do, I would really encourage you to apply all of these insights to yourself first, because unless we can be embodying these ideas in an authentic way, it's not really going to come across and be adopted. The other area of climate psychology that we're not covering today, but that I'm very deeply involved in, is around supporting young people and education. And if you'd like to look into that further, do explore my website, Climate Ed Psych. Okay, so diving straight in then to the psychology of climate resistance or stuckness and overwhelm. Now, you'll see I don't like to use the word denial there, but that's essentially what I'm talking about. Over the years, and I've been involved in this field for about 6 years now, we have realized that the word denial is incredibly pejorative and it's like pointing a finger at somebody. The minute we say, that person's in denial, it's a form of judgment. And I'm sure you all know somebody who's, particularly sensitive to judgment. When we point the finger and we blame and judge people, for some people, it can really evoke feelings of shame, often from childhood, actually. Um, so it's almost never a good strategy if we're in the business of trying to affect change and engage people. Um, but it's not just sensitive people that don't like this. Everybody really doesn't enjoy being criticized and blamed, okay? And the reality of um, our human engagement with climate change is that all of us from time to time just want to put our heads in the sand. We just want a little break from the difficult reality that we're all facing. So I kind of urge us today, if you remember nothing else, please remember that we are all learning together. All of us slip into denial and resistance at different times, and that imperfect action is better than perfect inaction. So, with that caveat out of the way, I'm going to offer up some of the psychology of why it is some people find it so hard to engage with climate change. And I like to break it down by the different stages of climate engagement. Um, so first we'll look at some of the barriers to understanding climate change, then the barriers to perceiving it as a threat, assuming responsibility, managing all the feelings that come up around this um, before we're ready to take action. So the psychology of denial and stuckness starts with understanding. It's no surprise to you that most of us did not receive adequate education in climate change and its impacts and all of the systems that are involved. And nowadays, as adults particularly, many of us are just busy trying to put food on the table. And it is no judgment upon anybody, I believe, that they have not had time to educate themselves upon this. Um, Climate change and the ecological crisis is a hyper object, something that is so vast and all-encompassing that it's actually impossible for one human brain to sort of understand it fully all at the same time. We can only sort of glimpse different pieces of it. So we have to get our information from somewhere. We have to trust sources of information. And of course, nowadays, when we try and learn or look up sources, um, well, actually, even before the internet, we are subject to a classic piece of psychology, the confirmation bias or the optimism bias. We love to be told things we already know, and we love to read things that confirm what we already know, but that also make us feel good. This is the optimism bias. And what can happen when you throw social media into the mix is obviously the algorithm serves up more of what makes us feel good and what we want to see, and we end up down a little rabbit hole of our own echo chamber. Oops, I'm in the wrong place. Thinking about the internet then, clearly again, nowadays there is so much nonsense and misinformation and conspiracy theories out there that are amplified by various bots and troll farms, which can be very hard to cut through, especially if you don't know what the truth is in the first place. And the problem with so much of this, well, the conspiracy theories being out there, just there's something called the illusory truth effect, whereby if we hear the same lie again and again and again, it actually begins to feel true to us. So that phrase, global warming is a hoax, although we might dismiss it the first or the second time, at some point, on some level, it does actually make its way into our model of the world. So it can be very dangerous. So even if we've educated ourselves and we understand the basics, at least, of climate change, the ecological crisis, and its impacts, it can still be really hard psychologically for us to perceive it as a threat. Dan Gilbert, the Harvard psychologist, talks about his pain theory, saying that news providers are motivated to offer up information that is personal, abrupt, immoral, or happening now. So historically, something like a local terrorist attack would have felt far more personal, abrupt, and immoral and happening to us right now than a report of 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That being said, increasingly there are plenty of very personal and quite shocking climate impact stories arising, and certainly the immorality of a lot of the fossil fuel cover-ups is garnering more traction now as well. We also have, and this is a big one, it's also hard for people to perceive climate change as a threat because we have various groups now operating to downplay the seriousness of the problem. So it's not quite the same as straight out denial. They're saying global warming exists, but they are suggesting that we're going to be able to just green growth our way out of it. I won't spend too long discussing this here, but if you do want to dive into this further, I recommend taking a look at the IPI report that came out last week. They did quite a deep dive into all the various groups that are out there spreading misinformation around climate change. Global Warming Policy Foundation is one of the big ones, by the way. Okay. And then finally, another piece of psychology that stops a lot of people from really having a visceral sense of climate change as a threat is that we really struggle to think mathematically. We look here at these tiny little numbers, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and you'd be forgiven for thinking, oh, that's not a big deal. You know, the temperature can change from that much day on day quite easily. Um, it can be quite hard if you're not good with numbers to actually appreciate what the global average temperature change means and what are the implications for different weather impacts around the world. Equally, the language of averages, we're terrible at that. You know, when people talk about the risk of the AMOC collapse being quite uncertain, people think, oh, that's okay. You know, they might confuse uncertain with low risk, even though it is low risk for now. And the other one, which I see all the time, and actually is exploited by these misinformationists, is the modeling of future predictions. We really struggle, our brains, we struggle to understand an exponential curve, a curve that goes up like that. What we tend to do is anchor our experience in the last few available data points. So we might look back at the last few summers and think, oh, okay, you know, last summer was a bit wet. Summer before that was pretty hot. And then we kind of extrapolate forwards. But unfortunately, what we know mathematically about a lot of the climate impacts is that because they cascade into each other, they do follow this steeper exponential rise. So even if we understand climate scientifically, we understand it to be a genuine threat to many lives on Earth, we can still be caught in a sense that it's not our responsibility. We can still struggle to assume responsibility. Um, if you like to look into this further, do Google Gifford's dragons. He's got 33 different psychological biases that stop us from thinking it's our job, our responsibility. But I just want to share four of them here today that are really the four that I think crop up the most frequently, and certainly four that I've been slipping into from time to time over the years. Um, so the first one, techno salvation. We see this a lot in the sort of Silicon Valley peeps. The belief that technology or nowadays AI will save us. Um, Clearly, AI solutions are now going to be essential to support the efficiencies we're going to need. But we really need to be backing up these technological advancements with the right societal structures and mentality. Otherwise, um, well, who knows what could happen. Another cognitive bias, classic one again in psychology, is the bystander effect, which is the effect, you know, observable again and again in a large group. We tend to assume somebody else will fix it. So, you know, certainly when I was in my 20s, even though I'd studied atmospheric physics and energy studies and climate science, I I just assumed that the governments would stick to their agreements, and I assumed that they would have it all in hand. Um, and it's only recently now I've realized actually the responsibility is on each and every one of us to shift the system together. Um, Inconsistent worldviews. Now, this one crops up quite a lot, actually, and it's all to do with identity, this sense of who am I, what groups do I belong to, and where do I get my value from? So we see this a lot, you know, with certain allegiances to political parties. And I won't start naming them, but you can imagine that if you say if you're anti-immigration and that you support a party that's anti-immigration, that party often also is anti-climate change action. So you kind of feel people tend to feel that they need to align their beliefs to align with the group that they identify with. This can happen at smaller scales, though, with, say, you know, if you're a person that loves luxury travel, and that, you know, this is include many of the people I know love it. that's one area that's really hard to detangle from your sense of identity, self, and value, and what you love in life almost. So it can be really hard for us to put those beliefs, loves, values, and attitudes to one side in order to actually look at the reality of what we need to do. And down here on the right, the sunk costs fallacy. I can't see my pointer, so I'm scribbling everywhere. Um, this is the most understandable one. And, this is a classic in the investing world that if we've spent money on something, we want to hold on to it until we get value from it back. Um, but what we're seeing is, if say if you have a petrol car, we tend to hang on to it, or unsustainable infrastructure, we hang on to it until we feel we've got use out of it. Now, clearly, um, it is a privilege to be able to make these changes, and not everybody can. However, there are lots of situations, I believe, where changes could be made, but we're kind of clinging on to what we've already sunk money into, even though it will cost us more in the long run. Okay, and the final category of where we can get stuck in the process of taking action is in regulating our feelings, regulating overwhelm. And we're going to look at this more in a minute. But I just wanted to offer up some of the psychological thinking traps that people can fall into once they understand that climate is a problem and that we need to do something about it. The most common that I see in sustainability circles is this savior complex, people running around thinking everything's on them, and it can lead to burnout. It can, even in a sort of more extreme cases, people can um, struggle to, that sense of responsibility. We overdo it to the extent that it impacts on our ability to feel joy in our daily life. This is Brené Brown's concept of foreboding joy, whereby, say, if you do, give yourself time off and try and enjoy your day, there's these little thoughts creeping in of, oh, what if this doesn't last? Or, oh, maybe I should be doing more. That sense of guilt almost. Again, it's not a healthy way to be going about things. For me, as a parent, this one does crop up. Occasionally I might be having a lovely time with my children, and then that little seed of, oh, are they going to be okay? That crops up. Um, Very human, very natural, but it is our work to make sure that we're still able to enjoy our lives because that makes us better able to show up in a more sustainable way. Okay, some of these other traps here on the right, I won't dive into too much detail, but these two in particular, catastrophizing and black and white thinking, classics from cognitive behavioral therapy. And when we're thinking about this in a climate context, it's these all or nothing statements that can be quite doomy. Okay, and again, we've probably heard these narratives. We're all doomed. That's not true, and it's not helpful. Okay, the reality is far more complex and far more nuanced, and it's almost the human brain has evolved to take thinking shortcuts to try and understand a complex situation. So it's natural that we might jump to these black and white thinking shortcuts, but it's not the case. I do just want to point out emotional reasoning, actually. Again, and it might take a while for you to realize you're doing this, but if you have a fear, say a scenario in your head of what you're worried about with regards to climate impacts, it is almost certainly, that fear is almost certainly going to say more about you and your past experiences than the likelihood of what will actually happen. We, the situation we're facing is obviously different for everybody, but it's so messy and uncertain and complex that it's actually incredibly hard to predict, how things will turn out. So when you do get that fear of a scenario, and I've heard various over the years, um, we can acknowledge that it's there, but that does not make it real. That makes sense. Okay. So that was a quick rattle through of some of the ways in which we can get stuck. And I offer that up just to repeat, not so that we can go around judging everyone, but so that we can really listen to where people are at and understand where they're coming from. That's how you get people on board, is validating their concerns and also acknowledging that we ourselves might be slipping into some of these denial states from time to time. Um, so next up, I'd like to look at, say we've worked through some of those blocks. We now want to engage. We want to do something helpful and we want to engage others. How can we do that in a healthy way? The key, I believe, is to have the perspective that climate action is a social, it is a social effort. There is no way that any single one of us can do this. We need to be moving all levels of our social systems and economic systems and educational systems. We need to be moving it together with each other. And again, there is lots of social psychology to back this up. One thing I love to remember is the social comparison effect. Um, Again, a classic piece of psychology that is so fundamental to how we are as human beings. We have evolved to want to belong to a group. So we are constantly picking up social cues from each other, kind of copying each other in an unconscious way, all in an effort to stay in the in group. So what this means is that something as simple as holding a reusable cup, it influences other people. You know, if I walk around with this all the time, eventually someone might see it and think, oh, okay, maybe I'll try that. And then they do it. And then they influence some more people and then they do it. And what we have is this diffusion of innovations curve whereby social change happens quite slowly at the beginning. It's the yellow curve I'm tracing. And then it just speeds up as more and more people affect each other. And it only slows down when most people are already on board. We know experimentally that actually it's only 25% of a group needed to really get this curve going. Um, the question is, though, where are we? Where are we on the curve? And how would we know? Um, it's complex and clearly it depends upon what we put upon the y-axis. Okay, right there it says market share. But if you ask a question like, as has been done recently, um, in nature climate change, if you ask a question, do you want your government to take more climate action? There was a huge global survey. I think it was 130,000 people were asked, and we had 89% saying yes, they do want their governments to take more action. Interestingly, though, when they were asked about others' opinions, the figure was lower. We have this idea that only 43% of the population globally want their governments to do more. So what we have, and why I find this research really encouraging, we have this.
You put back in a study to
Could you
identify.
mute yourself, please, Rachel?
That's probably about right.
We have this perception gap. We have this belief that other people aren't as bothered as us. And actually, if we could just address that and help everybody understand that, no, we're all on board, basically. Yes, there are some people stuck in misinformation out there, but the majority of people by far are on board with taking climate action. If we can understand this, that actually increases our sense of collective efficacy and actually helps motivation to act. It's a sort of virtuous circle. Please do mute yourself, Rachel.
Same as the Soil Association one.
Do it. There you go. Okay. So understanding that climate action engagement, it's a social effort. What are some of the pieces of psychology we can use if we're trying to motivate a group? And I offer these up because I'm conscious that a lot of you are working in with that task, if you will. Just like any business has a vision, so too we need to have a vision of what we are trying to achieve, either in your company or as a country even, or ideally globally. We need to be telling stories or providing role models and case studies of where we are headed. Now, that might sound obvious, but from a sort of neurological perspective, what that does is it actually encourages your brain to grow new pathways, new neurons, so that you are better able to point in that direction when you go forward. It's the same psychology behind neurolinguistic programming, solution-focused brief therapy, narrative therapy, and even affirmations. Um, it literally does. It's almost like making a new road in your brain for us to travel upon. You can start the process of change just in your head. And what that does is we're then more open and receptive to stimuli that are in line with that proposed direction. So we're sort of better able to pick up on the opportunities. I do love, though, this concept of a throughtopian narrative. So rather than presenting idealistic utopian visions that at this stage might be a little bit out of reach, the stories we need to be telling are not utopian, not dystopian, but telling stories of how we're going to get through the challenging times and build a more sustainable world together. Because there will be challenging times, and we need to be honest about that so that when it happens, people feel, they're not blindsided and they don't feel they've been lied to either. This is particularly important if you have young people in your life, by the way. Okay. A just transition, climate justice. If you're in the business of making policy changes, in your own business or organization, or even actually just within your own family, perceived fairness really matters. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it actually affects how well the policy will be received. So the classic example here, the Gilets jaunes protests in France, where the government raised the tax on fuel. And of course, the people who were impacted the most were the labourers who were driving around in their vans all day. But arguably, they weren't the people who should be paying more because um, it's not fair. So, who can do or pay more? Paying attention to that and trying to make it as fair as possible. Clearly, it's never going to be perfect, but just demonstrating that we've thought about this makes a big difference. So if you are in a leadership role, leading from the front, I think goes a long way. Showing people that you are making changes yourself helps with this sense of perceived fairness, as well as being quite an inspiring role model. Here are some other little bits of psychology that might be helpful. Now, again, these are kind of just little behaviorist tweaks that can just help. So let's have a look at them. We have first up the framing effect. And this is really all about climate communication. How you explain a change or a new policy or something you want people to do. We really have to be highlighting the co-benefits. The minute we start talking about loss, people, we're very loss averse, like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. But if we instead talk about what we'll gain, people are right there with you. And again, there have been many experiments to confirm this effect. Happily, for many environmental changes, there are almost always lots of health and mental health co-benefits, and very often there's also money-saving benefits too. Nudge theory, we can we can actually this can make quite a big difference. If we're in the business of offering people things, we can set up our offerings in such a way that we're gently encouraging them to make the more sustainable choice. Lots of different ways of doing this. So this in the picture here is a sort of gamification of it. But even something as simple as putting the more sustainable choice closer or making it the default, um, that can really help people's decision-making abilities anyway. We face so many decisions throughout the day. We're quite happy just to be guided in one particular direction. And it's ethical because we're not making people do anything they're not choosing to. The reminders one, I quite like something as simple as a little timer in the shower in my family home. That's a little nudge. No one's being made to take a shorter shower, but just sort of helps you remember. Okay. And finally, celebrating progress. Now, this might seem obvious, but there is a reason that schools do so much of this. All of us love to have our efforts seen and acknowledged. It really fulfills that human need for competence, for relatedness, and for a sense of, I've done a good job. It's incredibly motivating to other people, and it makes sure that that momentum is sustained. So don't neglect this. It's super important to keep the narrative on where we want to go as well. Now, some of you might be in the business of influencing behavior change, not necessarily to groups or in an organization, but in one-on-one conversations with people. Now, by now, I would suggest that looking back at this diffusion of innovations curve, it's the last people here that they're officially called the laggards. It's not a very kind term. The people who are not yet convinced that we need to be taking climate action are probably the ones that you'll be having these kinds of conversations with. Um, I personally, if you work in sustainability, I don't think you want to be doing this too often because it is incredibly energy draining. And it can have a sort of impact on us when we spend time talking with somebody who is, still very firmly in denial. It can be very hard for us. So I think the first thing to do is choose your conversations wisely. You are in charge of your own energy, and if your energy is better spent helping people who are already doing good things, then, that's your decision to make. However, here are some tips that can help if we do decide to have these conversations. As we've said before, non-judgmental stance is the first thing. As soon as we start saying, oh, you really shouldn't be doing this or that, or oh, I'm not sure about that, we're going to put that us and them, one up, one down wedge between us. What we want to be doing is validating concerns. Because the concerns by and large will be valid. And what we can normally do is come to some place of shared value and connecting on shared priorities. So, for example, if you're having a conversation with somebody and they don't, I'll leave that example actually. No, I'll do it. Say they wish to take their children on a long haul flight around the world because they want their children to grow up into well-rounded human beings who experience different cultures. Great, you can connect on that understanding that the shared value is they love their children and they want their children to have a good life. Okay. And it's from that position that we can then talk about, the reality of what young people will be having to deal with going forward. That being said, it is not a good idea, and the flight issue is probably the trickiest, I would say. Do not try and convince anybody or should them. Um, the best thing we can be doing actually is really just showing that I'm quite happy living more in harmony with nature. I'm quite happily living a more sustainable lifestyle. Um, Again, it comes back to this highlighting co-benefits piece. So again, picking up the flight analogy, which I'm starting to regret, um, it's okay to talk about you've been on a beautiful train holiday and wasn't it lovely? But the minute I start suggesting people shouldn't fly, I'm going to lose people because we love flying. Okay. So with a bit of consciousness that I'm talking about flying too much, I'm going to move on now to the final part, where we think about how to handle the eco emotions, the climate emotions that might arise when we truly take a good look at the reality of the climate and ecological crisis. Now, really, this part should be at the beginning because I'm of the firm belief that many of us, particularly in Western cultures, we are not very well practiced in handling difficult feelings. We try and get rid of them. We try and distract ourselves or self-soothe through substance or process addictions, working very hard, picking up the phone, keeping busy, overeating, drinking, drugs. It is a real practice to actually allow those feelings to be in, to feel them in your body and to let them be there. But I promise you, it's the most liberating thing to be able to do that. And if I did not have that practice, um, I know that I would be in a lot more distress than I am. So let's take a look. As there are many sustainability professionals here today, I just wanted to throw in this small scale survey from last year where 92 sustainability professionals were interviewed about their roles and how they felt about it. I offer this up just because it might resonate with some of you. The key themes were a sense of eco-anxiety, imposter syndrome, perhaps because climate and all its implications are such a big topic, it's very hard to understand it all at once. Some of us are scrambling around trying to learn. It's changing all the time. And then these last three, I think perhaps are probably more relevant for people who have um, a sustainability role within a larger organization that isn't sustainability focused. If you are, if your post is a sort of tokenistic box ticky position within a larger organization, what they found is that you're likely to feel loneliness, a sense that the company is greenwashing, and concerns that you might not be able to rise within the ranks of your organization. So it's a tough job working in sustainability, not only because we have to deal with a lot of this resistance that I was talking about earlier, but there's also these sort of competing pressures in addition to dealing with the difficulty of looking at the climate crisis itself. So it's for that reason that I suggest that developing a sort of self-care, self-regulatory practice is part of our role, it's part of our job. So here are some suggestions. Curate your news feed. Now, thinking back to the earlier slides where I was talking about that pain theory, how the news on offer wants to get eyeballs so that, we have these sensationalist headlines that sound a bit scary, but when you actually read it, you can tell that they've exaggerated or they've overblown it. I would strongly recommend taking a good hard look at who you're following assessing their credibility and assessing how far they're using sensationalist headlines to get you to click on it, because it does affect our baseline anxiety levels. And actually, some of us are going throughout the day in a sort of low level fight or flight state of activation. I'd also recommend limiting, our news consumption daily so we don't end up doom scrolling and sort of almost like training ourselves to feel worried. We need to be balancing that out with what's going well. It does exist, it's just lesser reported on. Clearly, if your job is to keep an eye on climate and environment news, that is tough. And there's this statistic that nearly half of the climate journalists out there are suffering from anxiety and depression. So all I would say is if you are in this space and it is your job to look at difficult facts all day long, really it needs to be part of your job to also balance that and to spend time regulating your nervous system. So how do we do that? How do we regulate ourselves? First step, I think, is to be monitoring these thinking traps that I was talking about earlier. Are you stuck in savior complex? Are you overgeneralizing? Are you finding that you can't relax and enjoy yourself? To do that, a mindfulness practice, often achieved through meditation, really is such a helpful thing to do. And when we say practice, it's because it's like a muscle. You have to build up the skill of doing that, ideally on a daily basis. If this is completely new to you, I would recommend going online and looking at something like Insight Timer, which is a free, like Spotify for meditations. But there's so much out there that can help you develop this practice. Now, it's one thing just to look at our thoughts or observe our thoughts or be mindful of our thoughts. But what if we can actually really truly feel them and let them flow through us? There's one particular meditation that I dive into when I do a workshop on climate emotions. We actually practice this, and it's one of my favorites. Tara Brach, have a Google of it. It stands for recognize, allow, inquire, and nurture. If we actually develop the habit, say if we get a bump of anxiety because we've read a difficult headline, if we actually develop the practice of recognizing we're having that difficult feeling, allowing it to be there, inquiring about where is it in my body? Is it a tightness in my chest? Is my throat tight? Do I feel a bit like a butterfly? Whatever it is. And then nurturing that feeling, like actually letting the muscles around the tension relax. It helps the energetic bump of the emotion, the energy in motion, it helps it actually dissipate out. The minute we start trying to distract ourselves or make ourselves feel better, we risk falling into denial narratives, or we risk holding that energy as tension in our bodies, which can actually make us ill long term. If you're still not convinced, I love this um, this, I suppose it's not a fact, this proposal, Rosenberg. If you actually sit with a feeling at that physiological bump of hormones and neurological activity and that sort of muscle tension, the cycle of a feeling only lasts 90 seconds. It's because of all the thoughts that we add on top, trying to make it go away or trying to solve it. That's actually what keeps the energy around. Clearly, climate change isn't going away anytime soon. So this is something that we'll have to be returning to again and again. But there are things we can do, like monitoring thinking traps, like sitting with our feelings, that can make the anxiety less than it needs to be. Oops. All right. Building resilience to uncertainty. Again, this needs more unpicking, but just to say that we, certainly in the West, have become very used to planning, ensuring, and organizing our lives to make sure that we know exactly what is going to happen at all times. The reality is that life is uncertain. We can't guarantee that things will turn out the way we want. And the sooner we can get used to things changing, the sooner we can get used to the uncertainty that is almost certainly coming our way, the less distressing it will be. So again, if you've got children, um, and particularly if you have children with sort of who are on the autistic spectrum, this can be a real challenge. But just making slight little tweaks, like taking a different route one day or choosing a program you're unfamiliar with, and actually saying, yeah, this feels a bit uncomfortable to me, but I think it's okay. That small practice can really help people um, become more comfortable with uncertainty and change. And finally, the 5 ways to well-being. Now, this might seem obvious and boring, and clearly we all know that things like eating well, sleeping well make a difference. But the New Economics Foundation, they've studied this and they, over many meta-analyses, and they realize that if we do take notice, particularly of nature, if we're active, if we connect with others, keep learning and give, we are healthier. And this isn't just a nice to have. What it does is it widens our window of tolerance so that basically, we're going to be more resilient. If we are taking care of our body and our human needs, we're not going to be as snappy and reactive when things go a bit wrong. We're going to be able to, literally, our nervous systems won't get activated quite so easily. So the 5 ways to well-being, something like doing a litter pick in the woods whilst somebody is pointing out tree names, that hits all 5 ways to well-being, right? And I promise you, you will feel amazing after doing something like that. It's not a waste of time. So we know that connecting with others is helpful for well-being. Okay, this is obvious, but it's has a very kind of solid psychological grounding to it. We are social creatures and we absolutely have evolved to need that social connection. This was talked about at great length in COVID too. But when we're thinking about climate and its impact, um, community cohesion, community connections are actually going to be one of the best ways that we can adapt and prepare for climate impacts. So if you haven't done so already, get to know your neighbours, set up some WhatsApp groups, start sharing and organising fun events to build that kind of social mesh that is going to really make a difference if we do start to experience disruption to, normal supply chains or flow of services that we rely on. We can also take a lot of solace, comfort, and community from linking up with climate groups. Climate Psychology Alliance offer climate cafes, which are, if you're not familiar with them, they're spaces where you can come and just have that sense of, I'm not alone. There are other people who get this. And actually, that process of breaking the taboo and talking about what we don't normally talk about, at the school gates or whatever, that is incredibly cathartic, incredibly healthy. And again, it helps the energy move out of you rather than keep it all stuck inside. So I do run a version of the climate cafes for staff groups. I personally think that there's something really lovely about addressing this within your work team, particularly if you also include questions about what helps and where are we headed and how can we do this in a way that feels good to us. So the last 2 slides were thinking about everyday healthy habits, basically. There will be times when we feel really agitated. Our nervous systems flip into that fight or flight response where the heart beats faster, our breathing quickens, our muscles feel tense. It feels horrible. And we all know what that feels like, right? That sense of anxiety, dread, fear. It can be really helpful to have tools in your pocket to know how to calm yourself down when you get into that state, right? Um, and actually, the tools aren't rocket science, but I'll talk you through it. Um, the first step, and I think this is where most people go wrong, is we need to really be giving ourselves permission to calm down. Normally, if we have a moment of climate dread, it's because we're looking at reality, normally, if there's no thinking trap involved. Um, so what some people do is kind of cling on to this idea of, oh no, but it's a real threat. I can't forget it. Trust yourself that you will still be able to look at reality with a calmer brain. And we know that being in the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest state, is when we're able to access the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, logical reasoning part of our brain. We will be making better decisions if we're calm. So giving yourself permission to self-regulate. It starts with looking around you, and if it's just anxiety we're facing rather than a natural impact or dangerous situation, I'm safe right now. It's okay to get calm. Step one. Step two is where we tell our bodies to calm down. We mimic the slow breathing or the calm, quiet mind or the relaxed muscles that take our body from that agitated sympathetic nervous system state down to a more rest and digest activity. Now, there's so many different ways to do this. Using breath is the quickest and probably the most effective, but this is what I like to do with young children, and I was doing this in a school yesterday with 5-year-olds actually, so it's completely possible with everyone. Um, Slow, deep breathing. I like to use the hand because it sort of brings your focus there, in and out. Or this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 naming technique where you say 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, hear, smell, taste. What that does is it kind of disrupts the rumination that might be going on in our brain. It stops those thoughts, and if you say it out loud, it kind of just brings you into the present moment and helps you remember that no, actually, I'm okay right now. Yes. And then finally, you'll be repeating that for as long as you need to until you notice your body is feeling calmer. Um, Final step is not beating ourselves up about it. It's okay for us to have a moment of dysregulation. In fact, it shows that we care. Um, so Kirsten Neff in the States is a wonderful guide for that practice of self-compassion. So you can even do something kind of physically soothing to yourself and, just sort of putting your hands on your neck or around you here. Oh, and talking to yourself as you would to a little child almost. And thanking your climate emotions for coming up. Because although I've talked about how to manage or how to help us feel better about our eco emotions, at the end of the day, they show we care, they show we human, and they are guides, these feelings, these difficult feelings, they are guides showing us where we need to change. And if we didn't have these difficult feelings, we almost certainly would still have our heads in the sand. So that's me. If you're interested in a talk for your workplace, do get in touch. I'm at Climate Ed Psych. We're going to have an opportunity for discussion, question and answers, if that's of interest. But I'm going to stop sharing and I'd like to invite you all to, if you're comfortable, to turn on your cameras and just take a moment to actually appreciate that we are in company, in a group with people who care about the climate and the environment and are all here, willing and able and trying to do something. And I think that is a beautiful thing. So thank you to you all.